many years. As their representatives, we have a responsibility to provide a reliable, comprehensive program of relief for that duration. To do any less is a dereliction of duty. I call on all of my colleagues to pass this FEMA supplemental bill as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. President, and I notice the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, recent days, the President has repeatedly told Congress to pass his stimulus package immediately. This began during his joint address to Congress last week when he said at one point, "I am sending this Congress a plan that you should pass right away. You should pass this jobs plan right away. Pass this jobs bill. Pass this jobs bill," close quote. Immediately following the President's joint address to the Congress, Press Secretary Jay Carney declared, quote, "The President will submit a bill early next week, the American Jobs Act, which will specify how he proposes paying for the American Jobs Act." So as ranking Republican on the Budget Committee and wrestling with these difficult issues, I know Senator Cardin is a member of the committee, and we try to figure out what this means and how much money the spending will be. But the bill that was transmitted to Congress Monday afternoon does not contain any fiscal tables, costs for any of its provisions actually, how those provisions will be paid for and when the pay for will occur, or even an overall price tag for the bill. So how can the President call Congress to, quote, "pass this bill immediately" when no one even knows how much it will cost, where the money is coming from? So I sent a letter yesterday to the President's Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Jack Lew, asking that this information be provided to the Congress at once. But so far we've had no response. Part of the reason we need this information is that the total cost of the President's bill may be much higher than advertised. That's been the pattern around here. No one should be surprised. When the President said his plan would be paid for, he did not specify if he meant the total cost to include increased interest resulting from the borrowed money to be spent immediately, or just the cost of the jobs provision alone, actually how much goes out the door. Depending on when the money is spent out and when it is paid back, assuming it is ever paid back, interest costs resulting from just this bill's borrowing could top $100 billion. In other words, the interest on the money over the 10-year window, the 10-year budget we're talking about, you spend $450 billion now. We pay interest on that money. It's borrowed money. People loan us the money and we pay interest. Interest rates are low now. CBO projects them to go up, our Congressional Budget Office. Certainly they will. They're extraordinarily low today. But at any rate, you could see easily the interest on this money over 10 years reaching $100 billion. Now, the problem with looking at it as a 10-year matter is that the debt's not going to be paid off probably in 10 years. Most of the programs that debts we run up will be part of our deficit. If we're going to raise taxes to fund a new program, maybe we ought to raise taxes to pay off the debt we've got instead of spending it on a new program. And the debt that we have distributes American wealth to people who hold our debt all over the world. So in my letter to OMB, I request tables showing the year-by-year tables for this bill's budgetary impact, including projected changes to the deficit for each of the next 10 years. In other words, how it will play out. We spend $450 billion in 1, 2, 3 years. how much does that run the debt up? And then when does the repayment begin? And how will it be paid and at what rate? And if the President wants to advocate for a sharp, near-term increase in the deficit in exchange for the possibility of an undefined economic future, for the possibility of a stimulus, he ought to make that argument clearly to the American people. I believe the President also needs to be honest in admitting that the bill's short-term cost would wipe out, obliterate the $7 billion in savings next year resulting from the debt limit deal. In other words, we went through this long, painful exercise that resulted in an agreement on the 11th hour and the 59th minute to save $900 billion and then hopefully form a committee that would save another $1.1 to $1.5 billion. Only a fraction, trillion dollars. A fraction, this $2.1 billion in savings of the $13 trillion Congressional Budget Office tells us will be added to the debt in the next 10 years. So it would save a little over $2 trillion over 10 years, and it would, but in the same time, we're running up over $10 trillion in debt. So it's not a big enough step. It's a step. It was progress, and I certainly respect that, but it wasn't much. And to show you how small it is, next year we are projected under that agreement that Congress ratified to reduce spending $7 billion. That's all. It's all that would be reduced from this year to next year in actual spending levels. So I ask my colleagues, don't we need to be careful? After all the effort we took to achieve that much savings, shouldn't we think very, very carefully about a new stimulus plan that would spend $450 billion obliterating that savings? I think we should. I think we should. But anyway, any rate, we do need to know precisely how much it's going to cost and precisely how the money would be spent. So let's flash back to February. The Office of Management and Budget Director Jack Lew said this, quote, this was when the President submitted his budget for the next 10 years. It was brought up here on the floor of the Senate. In fact, I brought it up, and it was voted down 97-0. But this is what Mr. Lew said about that budget. Quote, our budget will get us over the next several years to the point where we can look the American people in the eye and say we're not adding to the debt anymore. We're spending money we have each year. And then we can work on bringing down the national debt. Now, Mr. President, we all know there's a certain amount of political license that people get to utilize around the political world, and exaggeration sometimes is forgiven. But let me tell you, this is the Office of Management and Budget talking about the President's budget that he had just submitted to Congress. He said it will get us to the point over the next several years to where we can look the American people in the eye and say that we're not adding to the debt anymore. We're spending money that we have each year, and then we can work on bringing down our national debt, close quote. What is the truth? Congressional Budget Office scored this budgetary plan. And this is what they concluded, that over a 10-year period, there would be huge deficits every single year. And in about year 6 or 7, the lowest deficit would occur. $750 billion would be the lowest annual deficit that would occur. And by the 10th year, it would be back up to $1 trillion. President Bush's largest deficit he ever had was $450 billion. And he was criticized for that. So we're going to have the lowest, and he says this is going to pay down the debt and wouldn't be adding more to the debt if we passed his budget, when his budget spent more, taxed more, and ran up more debt. The most irresponsible budget, I believe, ever submitted to the Congress of the United States at a time of national crisis when all experts are telling us the greatest threat to our national security is our debt. So forgive me if I want to see the fine print on this legislation. When an administration will tell you that, and the President said very similar things. The President himself said very similar things. We would not be adding more to the debt. So we may have, in Congress, raised the legal debt limit. I did not vote for that particular bill. But we have breached, I'm afraid, our economic debt limit. America's $14.5 trillion gross debt is now 100% of our GDP, our economy. Experts tell us we have already crossed a dangerous threshold. Our debt is pulling down growth and putting a damper on job creation right now. So we have to ask ourselves, Mr. President, can we continue to borrow, running up even more debt in the hope that we can spend it today in a sugar-high type stimulus, create jobs in the short run? Congressional Budget Office scored the first stimulus package 2 years ago that's come nowhere near achieving what was promised for it. And they said, okay, if you spend $825 billion now, you'll get some short-term economic benefit. But scored over a decade, you'd have an economic decline. The net growth of the United States would be less over 10 years than if you didn't pass a stimulus package at all. And when you get up to 100% of GDP, I submit it's even more dangerous to keep running up debt. So this is a dilemma. We're in a fix. The economy is not growing the way we'd like it to grow. Experts were projecting, CBO was projecting in January of this year, they were projecting that economic growth for the first 6 months would be about 2.9%. And we were hoping that would be true. But what happened? The first quarter of this fiscal year, 0.4%, not 2%, not 2.9%. And the second quarter was extremely low also. We've averaged about 1% growth the first half of this year. So we want to do something to help this economy grow. I submit we should do everything we can that would help our economy grow now that does not run up the debt. What are some of those things? Producing more energy at home, creating jobs here, pumping more energy supply, which could bring down the cost of energy. So we could bring down the cost of energy, create jobs, create tax revenue, create growth that way. We should eliminate every regulation that's not beneficial to this economy, and there are a lot of them. Some regulations are good. Many of them just add costs to the entire economy for little or no benefit. And we need to have the kind of tax reform of a permanent nature that creates confidence in our economy, the kind of tax reform that advances economic growth rather than just increasing taxes to give Washington more money. So those are my suggestions about how to deal with this. First and foremost, we're going to look at this proposal. We certainly are worried about the status of the economy today. We are deeply disappointed in the job numbers that continue to disappoint, and hopefully we'll find the key to changing that. But fundamentally, the economy will come back and jobs will come back when growth occurs, and growth will occur not in the public sector but in the private sector, and we need to ask ourselves what it is we can do to create a better climate for growth and job creation, and we need to be rigorous in analyzing the President's proposal, and I intend to look at the details of it and how much it's going to cost and how they plan to pay it back. I think at a very minimum we're entitled to that. I thank the Chair and would yield the floor.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I thank my colleague and friend from Alabama for coming to the floor. We see the world a little differently, but we both acknowledge that we are in an economic situation at this moment in time where action is the only alternative. Doing nothing is unacceptable. And when President Obama came to speak to us in a joint session of Congress last week, that's what he told us. He basically said, let's roll up our sleeves, work together, both political parties in Congress for a change, and do something about this economy. 14 million Americans out of work. The report now from the Joint Economic Committee and others about the highest level of poverty in our country in decades. The problems that working families are having week to week, month to month, and year to year, falling behind despite all their hard work. Their wages aren't rising to keep up with the cost of living. Many are surviving paycheck to paycheck. A survey taken recently across America asking working families the following question: could you come up with $2,000 in 30 days if you had to, either out of savings or borrow it? 53% of working families said yes, and 47% said no. That's how close to the edge almost half of working families are living. A $2,000 medical bill at an emergency room is almost nothing these days. It's for a minor injury. And these families could not come up with it. That's what they're facing. And that's why the President said, let us focus on doing things that will help these families and equally, if not more important, help small businesses create jobs. There's no argument here about creating an army of government jobs. That's not even on the table. The President's not proposing that. Here's what he said. Let's give a tax cut, a payroll tax cut to working individuals so they have more take-home pay. I took a look at what it would mean in the state of Illinois. It would mean for the average income, which is $53,000 a year, that family would get $1,400 in tax cuts, $120 a month. I think it's worth something to working families to have that much more in their pocket to meet the needs of their family and perhaps make some critical purchases for their children, for their future, whatever it might be. That is a tax cut the President has proposed. He also proposes a tax cut for small businesses if they will hire unemployed people. A tax credit of up to $4,000 to hire these folks. Take them off the unemployed rolls and put them to work. I went to several job centers, Mr. President, during the August recess, one in McHenry, Illinois, one in Elgin, Illinois, and I spent the better part of the day sitting with unemployed people talking to them. You ought to go there. If you think the unemployed of America, the 14 million that we hear the statistics on, are living the life of luxury on their unemployment checks, they're not. Most of them are struggling to survive, and many of them desperately come each day to a job center to brush up their resume, to find out the latest people asking for new workers and put in new applications day after day after day, and many of them discouraged after submitting hundreds of applications with no response. Some go back to school. I met a couple that had really made the right life choice, going back to take courses at community colleges where they could afford it, or in job training centers where there would be no charge to them, pick up a new skill in an area where you can get a job. That is the reality, and the President is trying to create tax incentives for small businesses to hire those people. Now, usually, the Republicans who come to the floor are applauding tax cuts. My experience is they're for tax cuts in times good and bad. But this time, they're against these tax cuts. Well, what's the difference between these tax cuts and the ones that the Republicans historically support? There are two differences. The president's tax cuts are focused on middle-income families, not the wealthiest. And they are the president's tax cuts. Those are the two differences. I hope that some on the Republican side will reflect on the fact, as the president said, the American people are not going to reward us for our campaign rhetoric if this economy doesn't turn around. They want us to work together to solve the problems facing our economy. They want tax cuts for working families. They want small businesses to have an incentive to hire people. They want us to focus on creating good-paying jobs right here at home. What kind of jobs? Building America. As the president said, if we're going to succeed in this world, we need to out-educate our competitors, out-innovate our competitors, and out-build them. I went to China over Easter. It is incredible what's happening in that country. They are building in every direction, building cranes and construction activity everywhere. They are building the infrastructure in China to become the #1 economic power in the world in the 21st century. And what are we doing? We're hearing speech after speech saying because of the deficit, we cannot invest in America. We cannot invest in education, some say. We can't invest in research, they argue. We can't invest on building America. I think they're wrong. The deficit is a serious challenge. But even the Bowles-Simpson Commission, which I served on and voted for, said when you get serious about cutting spending, do it when this recession is behind you. They know, we know, you can't balance the budget with 14 million Americans out of work. And let me say a word about the safety net in America. I made a visit in Champaign, Illinois, to a food distributing operation. They distribute food to pantries and soup kitchens all around central Illinois. Unfortunately, their business has never been better. More and more families are showing up in these places for a helping hand. And I went in there to hear how they're doing. They're getting a lot of help from the private sector that donate food that's near expiration, for example, and a lot of contributions from churches and charitable individuals. It's really heartwarming to see it. As I went to tour this place, there was a young woman there. She was an attractive, well-dressed woman, and I assumed she worked for this food depository. And then she said to me that she had a job in the local school district as a teacher's aide. And I was a little bit puzzled as to whether she was on the board of directors or what her connection was. She came there to tell me that as a single mom with 2 little kids, even with a job in the school district, which she was happy to have, she still needed food stamps to put food on the table every day for her kids. You know, I don't think Americans, those of us lucky enough to never have to worry about the next meal, know what families are going through. Working families struggling with low income, trying to keep their kids well fed and to do what every parent wants to do. More and more they're going to soup kitchens very quietly because that's a meal they don't have to pay for. They're going to the pantries to pick up the groceries. I've seen them in one of the nicest and most prosperous counties in my state, DuPage County. I went to the pantries there and I saw the people coming through the door. You wouldn't be able to pick them out. But they are working families that need a helping hand. That is the reality, and that's why the safety net is so important. I'm troubled that so many people today are on food stamps, but I'm not troubled because they're on food stamps. I'm troubled because they have to be on food stamps. I hear some of these critics come to the floor and argue, you know, there are just too darn many people on food stamps. There's something wrong here. Well, what's wrong is not food stamps. What's wrong is hunger and low income and working families struggling to get by, paycheck to paycheck. That's what's wrong. And the numbers of Americans now qualifying for this food stamp assistance is even going up among those who are employed, like the lady I met in Champaign, Illinois. That's a reality. Something else is happening, too. As more and more people lose their jobs, they lose their health insurance. When I sit down with the unemployed, that's one of the first items that comes up. Because once you've lost that health insurance premium that your employer helps you pay, most folks can't afford it. It's just way beyond them. So they're out there without insurance. They're vulnerable. Some of them have sick kids, chronically ill children, and they worry about it. They go to the free clinics. We're seeing more and more working families showing up at free clinics across America. That's a reality of this economy, too. So when we talk about cutting spending on Medicaid, keep in mind who receives Medicaid payments in America. In my state of Illinois, 36% of the children, 36% of Illinois children are covered by Medicaid insurance. When it comes to births in the state of Illinois, 52% of all births in Illinois are paid for by Medicaid. But the biggest single expense in Medicaid, neither one of those. 20% of the Medicaid recipients in my state account for 60% of the cost of the program, the elderly. Parents, grandparents, great-grandparents in nursing homes and convalescent centers, on Medicare and broke. Stay in there because Medicaid steps in and helps them keep things together so they have at least some care and some attention in the late years of their life. When we talk about cutting spending in Medicaid, we are talking about hurting the most vulnerable people in America. Children, like the kids of that single mom that I met, those who need prenatal care so their babies will be healthy, and, of course, the elderly who are stuck in that position. The same thing's true with Medicare. I understand Medicare costs are going up dramatically. I also understand the number of people under Social Security and Medicare is going to rise as baby boomers reach that age. But we have to take care that at the end of the day we protect the basic premiums and benefits that are presently available under Medicare. For a lot of Americans and a lot of seniors, it's their only health insurance. It's really what keeps them independent and strong. And we can't compromise that basic protection by privatizing Medicare or raising the cost of Medicare beyond the reach of senior citizens. Finally, when it comes to Social Security, let me just say that this is a program which means a lot. For 70% of Social Security recipients, it's a majority of their retirement. For 25% of Social Security recipients, it's all they get. That's it. So guarding Social Security and protecting its future is important for our parents and grandparents. It's important for our country and for its future as well. The President came forward and he said, this is my jobs bill. This is what I think will help move America forward, put more spending power in the hands of working families, create incentives for small businesses to hire people, focus on putting firefighters, cops, and teachers back to work. That's a priority in our country for sure. And investing in building in America. One of the few lines the President had that got bipartisan standing ovation, there weren't many, last Thursday, was when he said, it's an embarrassment that 10% of our returning veterans are unemployed. Let's put our veterans back to work. That's part of the President's plan. Now, when I listen to the Senator from Alabama, he doesn't like the way the President pays for the plan. But he does pay for it. It doesn't add to our deficit. How does he pay for it? One thing he does is to dramatically reduce the federal subsidy to oil and gas companies. Filled up your tank lately? Take a look at what they're charging at the pump. Illinois, most places, it's over $4. And that is translating into the highest reported profits in the history of American business. Oil companies have never, ever had it so good. And President Obama has said, and I agree with him, if there was ever a moment in time when the federal subsidies to these oil companies should come to an end, this is it. And the money saved should go to small businesses and families across America in this difficult economy. The President also believes, and I agree with him, the wealthiest among us, those who are most comfortable, should be asked to share in the sacrifice. Now, there are some on the other side who would not accept 1 penny more in taxes on the wealthiest people in America. I don't get it. As I travel around Illinois, a lot of families are sacrificing in this tough economy. They know they have to. It's the only way they're going to make it. And they know that some of the government programs which have been around in the past aren't going to be there in the future, maybe not as generous. If working families and middle-class families across America accept that reality, why can't the wealthiest families in America accept it too? Honestly, I think they can. By and large, the people I know who are blessed with a lot of wealth and a pretty comfortable life have said to me, Senator, I don't need all this. I don't need all that Social Security payment. I can get by without it. I don't mind paying a little more in taxes. Those are people I run into. But you hear from the other side that is totally unacceptable. Some of them have said the President's plan has fallen flat on its face because it taxes the wealthy in America. I think the wealthy should pay their fair share. And I think the President's plan is an honest, good plan that moves us forward. So for those who are critical of it, give me your alternative. I wrote down here what the senator from Alabama suggested. He wants more energy produced here at home. I'm for that. I think we ought to go to places where it's environmentally responsible and produce more energy here in the United States. But I will say two things to keep in mind. Number one, all of the known oil and gas reserves in the United States of America that we can reach onshore and offshore equals 3% of the known oil and gas reserves in the world. 3%. Each year, the United States of America consumes 25% of oil and gas consumed in the world. We cannot drill our way into energy independence. We can expand the base, do it in an environmentally responsible way, perhaps find better sources, newer sources for things like natural gas, but this is not the answer to our prayers. And secondly, moving toward energy efficiency is not only good for the environment, it's good for the bottom line, for a family and for a business. Promoting efficiency. My wife and I take a little pride in the fact that we own a car, a Ford Fusion hybrid, and we were kind of patting ourselves on the back a little bit as we came back from vacation in Michigan, and we're getting 36 miles a gallon. Felt pretty good about it. I was bragging to my friends about it. Now I'm bragging on the Senate floor. It can be done. We can create more fuel-efficient vehicles. We didn't compromise anything. No, we bought American. And I think that's what we need to encourage in this country. Cars and other energy-saving equipment made in this country, creating jobs in this country, reducing the need for energy from being imported from overseas, and reducing the pollution that unfortunately hinders our environment and our health. I think that's a good thing. So on the Senator's first point, sure, more energy at home, but put it in perspective. That isn't the answer to America's economic needs. The second point he says is eliminate certain regulations. That could be true. I'm sure the President agrees. There are things, regulations now that don't make any sense. Get rid of them. I'm not sure this is a big ball and chain being dragged around by our economy, but there's no sense in wasting time or money on regulations that really don't serve a good public purpose. And the final point he said, I couldn't agree more, tax reform. We lose $1.2 trillion a year to the tax code. Credits and deductions and exclusions and special favors written in the tax code for businesses and individuals, that's got to come to an end. I actually think that's a good way to raise revenue and maybe even reduce marginal tax rates for corporations and individuals in the process. That's what Bull Simpson said. So even my friend from Alabama who spoke earlier, even he and I can find some common ground. I hope he'll agree with me and the President. Doing nothing is unacceptable. The President has said no more games, no more delay, no more politics. Do something. That's a message I got in August as I returned to Illinois. It's a message I hope my colleagues share as well. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.
Mr. Akaka.
The clerk call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Without objection, the senator is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. I come to the floor as I do almost on a weekly basis to talk about the health care law. And I do that as a physician, someone who's practiced medicine in Wyoming for a quarter of a century, taking care of Wyoming families. And I come because I have great concerns about this health care law. We know history proves that landmark pieces of legislation written in Congress often contain drafting errors at one stage or another during the bill's development. And this is one of the main reasons that most landmark bills are written and negotiated in an open and a transparent manner. Writing and negotiating bills is, in a way, helps members of Congress minimize mistakes. It helps uncover any unintentional consequences. It helps fix problems. And this is done through rigorous committee and floor debate, as well as House Senate conference committees as the bills go through the process. Most importantly, doing something in an open and transparent manner gives the American people, the folks at home, an opportunity to read a bill, to study it, to think about it, to discuss it during town hall meetings with their members, and to ask questions and weigh in. Well, unfortunately, Mr. President, we all know that the largest health care law ever enacted didn't undergo an open, transparent, or bipartisan process. President Obama promised the American people that they could watch the discussions and the writing process, he said, on C-SPAN. Well, instead, the President and Democrat leaders in both the House and the Senate sealed themselves behind closed doors. Their strategy? Pass sweeping health care legislation based on stealth and speed. Use sound bites to sell America about expanding coverage, about cutting costs, about improving quality, and then offer very few details explaining exactly how the bill would impact individual Americans nor what it would cost the country. Well, while this entire strategy was being played out, the President and Washington Democrats were writing the legislation behind closed doors. Why? Well, to limit the time that the bills could be read and reviewed by the American public. Some in Washington thought that rushing a health care bill into law before America could read it was the perfect way to avoid public debate and public questioning. Many of us recall when former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi infamously said that first you have to pass the bill to find out what's in it. Well, the President passed his health care law, and the American people continue on a daily basis to find out what's in it. And they don't like it, and it's easy to understand why. As the American people have had a chance to read the details, they started asking more questions. The numbers simply weren't adding up. Health care costs they were seeing were going up, even though the President promised that health care costs would go down. There were costly mandates on small employers, and that was going to discourage hiring. Nancy Pelosi said they'd hire 400,000 people immediately. They haven't been hired. She said 4 million new workers. Ultimately, we haven't seen it yet. Mandates that we've seen have come out of the health care law do nothing to spur economic growth and help the 9.1% of individuals nationwide, 14 million Americans, who are currently unemployed, who are looking for work. And then even more government orders forcing individuals to buy one-size-fits-all government-approved insurance or face a fine. Well, the American people have now had 17 months to find out what is in the President's health care law, and one news report after another has been uncovering a laundry list of so-called glitches in the health care law. Well, former Speaker Pelosi wanted the American people to find out what's in the law, and 17 months later, the American people are finding out that the President and Washington Democrats didn't even write it correctly. On Wednesday, September 7th of this year, Investor's Business Daily printed an article titled, "Oops, No Obamacare Tax Credit via Federal Exchanges." The article explains that the way Obamacare was written, individuals who qualify for a taxpayer-funded subsidy to buy government-approved health insurance in the new state exchanges may not get it. Section 1311 of the health care law requires the states to set up state-run exchanges. This state-based exchange is a place where individuals can use their government subsidy to buy health insurance. Now, if a state declines to set up their own exchange, then Section 1321 mandates that the federal government set it up and run it for them. Here's the catch. The health care law, as written, as signed by the President, explicitly says that the taxpayer-funded subsidies can only go to people who are enrolled in exchanges set up by the state. Nowhere does the health care law mention that the subsidy can be given to people enrolled in the federal exchange. So the American people are now finding out that their family might actually qualify for government help to buy health insurance, but they're not going to receive the help. Instead, individuals enrolled in the federally run exchanges could be forced to buy health insurance that absolutely they cannot afford. Not only might this law cause individuals to spend money that they don't have, the law may also offer tax-funded subsidies to people who don't actually need it. Let me repeat that. The law may actually offer tax-funded subsidies to people who don't actually need it. At a time when our country can hardly afford to spend money we don't have, Medicare's chief actuary, Richard Foster, exposed yet another glitch in the President's health care law. The law allows approximately 3 million middle-class early retirees to qualify for Medicaid. Well, Medicaid is a safety net program designed to help low-income Americans. Here's how this one works. The health care law defines how the federal government will set an individual's Medicaid eligibility. The calculations are all based on income. Here's the glitch. The health care law excludes a large part of an individual's Social Security income from that calculation. Well, today, federal low-income assistance programs are required to count Social Security benefits as part of an individual's income. Thanks to the health care law, early retirees earning up to $58,840 a year could now be eligible for Medicaid. Here's what Mr. Foster said in an Associated Press article. He said, "I don't generally comment on the pros or cons of policy, but that just doesn't make sense." This is the chief actuary of Medicare. "I don't generally comment on," he says, "on the pros or cons of policy, but that just doesn't make sense." Well, Mr. President, I agree. That's why I've co-sponsored legislation introduced by Senator Mike Enzi closing this loophole. Senator Enzi's bill, S. 1376, changes the health care law's subsidy eligibility calculation to include all non-taxable Social Security income. The Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation estimate that if we enacted Senator Enzi's bill, we will save the federal government and the American people about $13 billion. The Senate should immediately take up S. 1376 and pass it. This is $13 billion we can save right now, today. Let's show the American people that when we see our country spending money that it shouldn't, that we will take a stand collectively as a Senate and stop it. Now, these two examples, inevitably beg the question, what next? Clearly, the self-described, quote, most transparent administration in history, close quote, has a lot of explaining to do. I just don't believe that my friends on the other side of the aisle who wrote this very flawed health care law, and they did it behind closed doors, I just don't think that they know what they are doing when they wrote these provisions. Now, how do I know that? Well, if they understood how devastating their policies would be, I think they might have had second thoughts. How many more disruptive, ticking time bombs are there lurking in this law and in the regulations that still haven't been written about this health care law that was signed a year and a half ago? We don't know. We don't know because many of the provisions don't even go into effect until the year 2014 or later. Well, as a physician who's practiced medicine a long time, cared for patients all around the state of Wyoming, been active in the Wyoming health fairs, bringing low-cost health screening to people all around the Cowboy State, I intend to fight each and every day in the Senate to make sure the American people will not have to find out what kind of additional ticking time bombs there are in the health care law. That's because I am more committed than ever to repeal the health care law and replace it with patient-centered care. Replace it with health care reforms that help American families get the care they need from the doctor that they want at a price they can afford. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk call the roll of the Senate.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President,
The senator from Louisiana.
I'd like to ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading of the roll.
Without objection, so ordered, and then the senator from Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I know that we've had several speeches in the last couple of hours on very important topics, the jobs bill, our efforts to stimulate the recovery, a response from our Democratic leader to Senator Sessions, and the good senator who was just speaking, talking about health care. But I've come to focus our attention, if I could, again this afternoon. We spent most of yesterday talking about a matter that is absolutely right at hand, and that is disaster relief funding, and calling on this Senate and the House of Representatives to focus some immediate and comprehensive thought and attention on this subject, which is affecting so many of our constituents, Republicans, Democrats, and independents, big cities, small towns, and rural areas all over this country. In fact, this is the first year in our memory and in, I think, the recorded recent history that, Mr. President, we've had a presidentially declared disaster in 48 of our 50 states. And just a few days ago, we, along the eastern seaboard and the Gulf Coast, where I'm from, representing Louisiana, suffered from the remnants of the original hit and then remnants of Tropical Storm Lee and then Hurricane Irene. And as some senators that joined me in a press conference earlier today, I think it was the senator from North Carolina, said, it's actually been three disasters: an economic disaster in terms of an economy that is weak and fragile, and we're doing our best to lift it and to strengthen it, and then Hurricane Lee, and then, or Tropical Storm Lee, and then Hurricane Irene. And it's been millions and millions of dollars of damage. Unfortunately, we on the Gulf Coast, and tragically, are getting to be experts in this field because we, as the senators and House members from the Gulf Coast, have battled multiple disasters over this last decade. Katrina and Rita, which broke all records, surpassed any planning this government has ever done, had a FEMA that showed up not ready, not comprehensive enough in its view. Our people have suffered, but we've made a lot of changes since then. And here we are today with actually a better FEMA from all accounts. And I want to give a lot of credit to this administration particularly, and not just Homeland Security, but the cabinet of this president has been really extraordinary in their reasonableness when it comes to this subject. And I've seen the opposite, so I think I'm in a position to see the difference. It's a big difference in this Obama administration in terms of the cabinet. They want to say yes to disaster victims. They don't want to say no. That's very important. They can't always say yes to everything, to rebuild every building, repave every street, elevate every home, but they're trying to say yes, and most importantly, the lawyers have been instructed to find a way forward, as opposed to instructions that came from the last administration, which was to find a way to say no. So let me just give credit to where credit's due to the Obama administration in their willingness to be flexible, to be forward-leaning, to have attorneys that are trying to be on the side of the taxpayer, on the side of the victims, and not shortchanging people in times of desperate need. Having said that, the administration can't do it all on their own. They need Congress, as the Constitution says, to provide the funding so that the executive branch can do their job. Now, the executive branch, by all accounts, even Republicans have come to the floor from states that have been hard hit and said it's a more muscular FEMA, it's a more dynamic FEMA, it's a more flexible FEMA. And I want to thank Senator Lieberman and Senator Collins. They're the authorizers. Yes, I've had a part of it, others have had, but they've worked tirelessly after Katrina and the disaster that happened on the Gulf Coast, to where we were all shamed when we saw what didn't happen that should have. We've fixed a lot of it, and that's something to be happy about and proud about. When government does set its mind to improve things, we can. But we can't do anything without the funding, and right now, FEMA is empty. The pot of money is empty. Projects, millions, hundreds of millions of dollars today, not just in my state, but in California, in Tennessee, in Iowa, in Texas, and in North Dakota, and I could go on, but for the record, let me just say a couple. In Tennessee, mitigation of private residences from the 2010 floods have been halted. Now, for those that might not be familiar with the word mitigation, which most people are, it means you could be elevating your house, you could be putting shutters or storm windows on your windows. Let's see what else. You could be potentially strengthening the frame of your house if you're trying to mitigate against high winds from a tornado. There are rules that allow people to try to improve your home so the next time it happens, not only are you not homeless, but taxpayers aren't paying again for the same sort of incident. And the federal government, under good policy, requires a certain portion of all disaster funding to be specific, Senator. The President knows this from Maryland, to go to mitigation, because taxpayers think when you're trying to rebuild from a flood or a storm or a tornado or a bridge collapse, don't just build the same old thing, try to mitigate so it doesn't happen again. That's smart, because then you're not double, triple spending taxpayer money. But in Tennessee, this family, let's say, is in the middle of elevating their home. Let's say they've gotten it off the ground by 2 feet, and the contractors showed up on Monday. They were sent home because this project has been stopped. So somewhere, there are homes in Tennessee, I'm not sure in what particular community, where private sector contractors, many small business owners, and their employees showed up to work and were told, go home, FEMA's out of money. We have to fix this week before we leave, and if not, at the latest by next week. Now, in Iowa, repairs for an electric utility. I'm not sure who provides utilities in Iowa. Potentially, it may be, because in my state and rural areas, the local rural co-ops. Everybody knows what a rural co-op is. Well, their project has been shut down. Now, potentially, people are still receiving electricity. I don't think people are sitting in the dark. I'm hoping not. But whatever they were planning to repair and fix in Iowa has been halted because we have run out of money. In Texas, repairs to the University of Texas medical facility has been stopped. In Louisiana, roadway construction has been stopped. In fact, there was an article in our paper, the Times-Picayune, just this week that said $100 million for Jefferson Parish. $100 million, that's just one of my parishes, one of 64, the suburban parish that sits right side of Orleans, that was very hard hit by these storms, not as hard as Orleans Parish, but received billions of dollars of damage. Those projects have been put on hold while we move that money to help the victims on the Northeast. That shouldn't be the case. We need to act quickly to refill the FEMA fund. In addition, I understand in North Dakota and in other places there are problems. Now, it's not just the DERF. The Corps of Engineers, in its budget last year, did not have enough money for emergencies. I slipped out of the chamber here just a few minutes ago to go actually meet with the mayor of Grand Isle, who was here, as he is quite often, advocating on behalf of the only barrier island that's inhabited in the state of Louisiana. And he brought up pictures, again, they're too small to see, but I'm going to have them blown up for tomorrow. But I have in my hand pictures of the levees that were just ripped up and destroyed, again, from from Tropical Storm Lee. These were levees on the Gulf that we just completed, but because the Corps of Engineers, when they rebuild levees in their authorizing legislation, they are prohibited, which makes no sense whatsoever, is a complete waste of taxpayer money. They're prohibited from betterment. They can build back what was there, but they can't build it better or higher unless they are directed to do so. Well, I'm about ready to direct them because I am tired on behalf of my people and the people of this country and the taxpayers from rebuilding levees 10 times in a matter of 5 years. It's a waste of money. It is aggravating to the people whose homes are behind these levees, and because we don't even have a policy when you're building levees to be ordered to build them stronger, higher, except, of course, in the case of some levee systems in Katrina that was specifically directed, and it's being done. We're building around the city of New Orleans a much stronger, much better system. You would think that would be being done all over the country, and it's not. And why? Because we're short on funding, short on political will, and short on imagination and creativity when it comes to building infrastructure in this country, and I, for one, am tired of it, and so are the people that I represent. And I'm asking the other side of the aisle to step up and to provide funding that is not offset in the middle of a disaster. We'll figure out how to pay for these later, these disaster funds later. But as I think Senator Leahy said so eloquently in our press conference today, do some people in the Republican Party actually believe we want fire departments all over the United States? When your house is on fire, they show up with the engine, and then they debate in the middle of the street how they're going to pay for the extra overtime to put out your fire? I don't think so. Even if the fire department is broke, even if the funding is run out, you don't want to have a debate over how you're going to pay for overtime when the fire is burning. You put the fire out, you bring the people to safety, you put the family in shelter, and then you go back to the city council meeting next week and you can debate for as long as you want how you're going to ultimately pay for it. We paid for World War II, obviously. It was a long time ago. It's completely paid for. We paid for World War I. We're paying for Afghanistan. We're paying for Iraq, which, by the way, not one single solitary Republican, and not many Democrats for that matter, but not one Republican that I can recall, stood up and asked or debated for 5 seconds how we were going to pay for the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. But when the people of Vermont stand in front of their bridges collapse, their homes collapse, their schools collapse, and say we need help, we have to have now a month-long debate on how we're going to pay for it. We haven't done this since the 1800s. Now, we will eventually pay for it. America has to pay for everything. We will pay for it. We don't have to have that debate now. What we do have to have a debate about is how do you repair levees, and what's the best way to mitigate, and what are the new technologies that can be used to make our communities stronger and smarter? How can we streamline the process? How can we eliminate the red tape? How can we get help to people faster? That's what we should be debating about. Instead, I've got Tanner and Boehner making us argue about what offsets. So I have to go to maybe the president's state in Maryland and say, Senator, what can you give up this year in your state? Or I have to go to Michigan, what can you give up in Michigan? Or I have to go to California, what can you all give up in California so we can pay for people that are underwater in Vermont and North Carolina? What kind of government is this? I don't want to be a part of that, and I'm not going to be. So we've got to fund these disasters now, and the saddest thing about all this, Mr. President, it's sad and it's also puzzling and it's perplexing and it's aggravating because we already sort of made this deal a month ago when we negotiated that big, agreement that we all came to about how the levels of funding would be for 2012. Everybody remembers that before we left for August, and we had this big knockdown, drag-out. Well, in that agreement, our leadership, Republicans and Democrats, already agreed to do something that I think is very smart, and I want to show you what they agreed to. Can we put that chart up on the expenditures? They agreed because it's a puzzlement. How do you fund in advance disasters? How do you know how much to set aside? It's a problem because every year is different, and I want to show you what our problem is. So people listening can give me their own suggestions about how to solve it. In 2003, we set aside in the whole budget of the United States, you can see this a little bit, $800 million for disasters. But we had $1.7 billion, so we were short $984. We funded it, and that went on our books. The next year, we said, well, this year we had $1.7 billion in disasters. So the next year, we put 1.8 in our bill, thinking we would cover it, because last year was 1.7. But lo and behold, we had an additional $3 billion worth of disaster funding. We didn't know these disasters were going to happen. So the next year, we increased the amount of money in our base budget. And then, lo and behold, in that year, we put $2 billion. Katrina hit, and the levees broke. And you know what the bill came in for, Mr. President? $43 billion. We had budgeted $2 billion because all in the history of the past, that's all we really needed to cover disasters. It went from 2 to 43. Now, who would have had a crystal ball to know that? Did we sit and debate? Well, some people tried to until I said there was no way I was going to have to find a $43 billion offset before we could let the people of the Gulf Coast know that help was on the way. So we spent what was required to help rebuild the Gulf Coast. And then the next year, you can see. So these numbers are very erratic. They're unpredictable. So what our leadership did, looking back on these 10 years and listening to the debate and the argument, they came up with a pretty good plan. This is their plan. They said, okay, we'll throw out the high number, we'll throw out the low number. Like in 2009, we didn't have any emergencies. Can you imagine one year you have no declared emergencies, and the next year you have a declared emergency in almost every state? That's how erratic this is. It's not like we're not trying to plan. It's impossible by the nature of what an emergency and disaster is to plan. You can plan for them, but you can't always predict exactly how many you're going to have and where they're going to be. Of course, everyone understands that. So what our leaders did is they threw out the top one, they threw out the bottom one, and they came up with an average, and that average is about $11 billion, a very reasonable approach. So they put in our agreement that we made 30 days ago, we said, okay, next year this is what the federal government can spend, and in addition to that, you can go up to the average. So you can spend an additional $11 billion, which is really a very small amount of money compared to the whole federal budget. So you would think that we would not be having this debate. Why? The need is very evident. The history would dictate that we don't have this debate over disasters, and the Republican and Democratic leadership has already provided a way over and above our 2012 numbers to pay for these disasters. So I ask, why are we having to fight for this? That is a very good question. I think it's because some people on the other side of the aisle think this is a good thing to fight about. They think that they have to go find a pay-for everything we do, even when I've described you can't predict, even if you do plan responsibly, you never know, as in the case of Katrina and Rita and Wilma, and because our leadership already negotiated a way forward for us. But yet, we have people now all over the country looking to the Republican leadership, listening to Representative Cantor, listening to Representative Boehner, Speaker Boehner say, I'd like to help you, ladies and gentlemen, but we have to find an offset. I think people say, well, why didn't we hear that when they sent troops into Afghanistan or Iraq? Why didn't we hear that when they're rebuilding Iraq and Afghanistan? The same people aren't standing up yelling and screaming, or didn't when we went in. And I think they have a good point. So I'm saying that I am proud of the Senate for last night with Democrats mostly, and yes, about 8 Republicans that voted to move this debate forward. I thank particularly Senator Blunt from Missouri, who's been an outspoken leader on the Appropriations Committee for the need to act now, to act quickly, to fund the DERF, to fund the Corps of Engineers. Of course, Missouri has had terrible, terrible tornadoes and flooding. Not only did they have Joplin, Missouri, but they had the great flood of the Mississippi River, which was the highest in 50 years. It was so high along our capital city when I visited with our mayor a couple of months ago, Kip Holden, in Baton Rouge, our capital city, which is now our largest city, since 100,000 people have left New Orleans to literally live on higher ground, although it's broken their hearts and divided up their families. They have moved to Baton Rouge, our capital city, as we rebuild our levees and our flood control structures stronger in the southern part of our state. And people spend time walking on the levees, riding bikes on our levees. Of course, mechanical vehicles are not allowed, and you can't have cars and trucks and four-wheelers because that would be destructive to our levees, and our levees are quite huge. And they're almost like linear parks. Well, for the first time in the history of anybody that can remember, the mayor had to declare everybody to stay off the levees because the water was so high and seeping through, we literally thought maybe even some of these great levee systems would breach. Happily, they did not. But it was a really frightening situation for millions and millions. And in some parts, up in Missouri and in other parts north of us, the levees did breach. And sometimes the levees were blown to protect other areas. It's frightening if you live behind or if your business is behind one of those levees, as North Dakota residents know all too well. But nonetheless, we should not be debating this. So I'm hoping that our bill will pass this week and get over to the House for a quick vote. And if the House decides to send us a continuing resolution, please, I want the House leadership to hear clearly what I'm saying, and I'm going to send them a message by letter in the next few minutes. Please do not think that you can nickel and dime recovery efforts, that you can fund it 6 weeks at a time or 4 weeks at a time. Disaster recovery doesn't operate that way. Our mayors, our governors, the Republican governor of New Jersey, the Republican governor of Virginia, the mayors of Patterson, who is with us today, and mayors up and along the East Coast that are with their people every day, the mayor of Joplin, Missouri, has to be able to know that he can plan a year out or 2 years out. How to rebuild an entire town is overwhelming, even if you have the money and the plan. Can you imagine if you sort of have a plan, but you don't know if the federal government's going to provide your money or not? Do you know the frustrating council meetings and school board meetings that will be had, and they'll say, well, the Republican Party in Washington can't figure out if we should get funding, but it's 6 weeks at a time. I am not going to allow that to happen. I'm just going to lay the line in the sand right now. That you may get around me on it, but it's going to take a huge effort to get around this desk on that subject. A huge effort. If I have to shut the Senate down, I've done it before, I will do it again. because I can tell you, as much as my name is Mary Landrieu, you cannot rebuild communities with 6-week plans. It took us a whole year, it took us 2 years to put together the Road Home program, Mr. President, 2 years after we got the funding. And the reason we couldn't put it together before, even though Mississippi had their money, because President Bush gave them their money right away but made the people of Louisiana wait, the reason we couldn't do our plan is because Congress wouldn't decide how much money to give us. No mayor, no governor, no matter how great they are, no matter how smart they are, no matter how many engineers they have, no matter how many Rotary clubs are helping, no matter what the Commerce, the Chamber of Commerce is doing, I'm telling you it cannot be done without a reliable source of funding. So the planners can sit down and say something like this: we lost 8 schools in this flood. They bring the community together. These are how these discussions go. We might not have money to build all 8, but we have money to build 6. Which 6 do you want to build, and where do you want to build them? What materials do you want to use, and which kids should go to which schools? I've been in these meetings. I am not going to allow the mayors and governors to call their people together and say, we lost 6 schools, and we don't know when the money is coming to build them, and we can't make any plans because the Republican leadership has decided that every 6 weeks they're going to let us know how much money we're going to get. That is not going to happen. So I want Speaker Boehner to think about this, and I want Mitch McConnell to think about this, and I want the Republican leadership. I will negotiate on the top number. I'll talk about maybe FEMA doesn't need quite this much. I'll talk about, well, maybe the Corps of Engineers doesn't really need that much, but I will not, under any circumstance, agree to a 6-month or 4-week, not 6-month, a 6-week or 4-week continuing resolution. You may run the government of the United States that way. We've unfortunately gotten used to it. That's a very sad commentary, I might say. We run the entire government of the United States, the greatest government ever created in the eyes and the visions and the hearts of mankind. We operate it on a 6-week basis. But that might be the game we play with the government, but I am not going to allow that game to be played with people who have lost their homes, lost their businesses, and people that look up from the storm and say, oh my gosh, what happened to me? And then they don't even know what's going to happen because we can't make a decision that lasts more than 6 months or a year. So the minimum will be 6 months. And I hope that we can find the will to do a whole year, because without that, you are going to shut down recovery operations at a time in this country where it is heartbreaking to think of small business owners who have lost their print shop, or they've lost their dress store, or they've lost their shoe store, and they see everybody talking about creating jobs. They used to have 3 of them last week selling their printing material or selling shoes or whatever, and they're trying to get their business back, and we can't decide whether, even though we have the money, and although we already budgeted for the money, although we already made an agreement about how we would do this, we're going to still argue. I tell you, if this is on the Tea Party agenda, I'd suggest they take it off. And if it's somebody else's agenda, please speak up. I have not had one single Republican senator come down and defend this position, because it's indefensible. So I hope when the leadership's negotiating, which they're negotiating right now, they will hear me in a summary very quickly. The FEMA pot is empty. The Corps of Engineers is always running on fumes. Levees are breaking and flooding is occurring in places that haven't flooded in 100 years. Would we wake up and realize that we have to put more money in emergency funding, and we have to be there when our people are hurting like they are now, and we will eventually pay for this? We don't have to figure that out in the next 30 days. We have to give them a green light, give them the billions of dollars they need to operate for a year. Everything else is negotiable, but it is not going to be negotiated. We're not going to rebuild 48 states or pieces of 48 states 4 weeks at a time. That will not happen. So whatever amount of money we give, let it be for as long as we possibly can make it. Let it be as robust as it can possibly be, and give a green light to our Republican governors, our Republican mayors, our independents, our Democrats out there, just shell-shocked right now about the work before them, and the people in neighborhoods that are still crying and in shock about what they have to do and making decisions. Should we come back? Should we not come back? What should our neighborhood do? What should our community do? Maybe we should all move to higher ground. These decisions are being made right now, and the last thing they should be worried about is Congress debating whether there's money there to turn that hose on. So let's do our job the way we've done it for, 150 years. Let's continue to do it and let our people know we're there for them, just like we try to be there for other people in the world that are caught in situations like this. We most certainly need to be here for our people in America. And I thank the Chair and yield the floor.